All right, 10-second answer right out front. Let's get into addressing Basham, Ortland, and why she is generally right, at least in my opinion, after my review. Now, if you want the more nuanced and detailed version, here we go. Here's a 50,000-foot overview and summary of this situation to date. For the purposes of this video, I'm going to be trying to keep my phrasing consistent, and so I'm going to be calling Megan Basham, Basham, and Gavin Ortland, Ortland. In 2022, pastor and online content creator, usually in the fields of theology and apologetics, Gavin Ortlund, created a video speaking out about global warming and how it was, to quote him, something that he thinks about every day, and that is a big deal that he wants the church to talk about more. We'll dive in a lot deeper to the specifics of what he said, but that's a fair overview for now. In 2024, Megan Basham became the published author of the book Shepherds for Sale. This book speaks about the money and power driven encroachment of left wing culture, ideals, and doctrine into the Western evangelical churches, usually by dangling the carrot of power and or money in front of evangelical leaders and using them then to spread left-wing ideals and leveraging that on the voting days that they face. This book has a wide net of the individuals and organizations who it addresses, and it deals with them with varying degrees of seriousness and severity. Some people are addressed on a personal level, some organizations are addressed in a general level, some are called more to the carpet than others, some people are called out for something they may have said that seems wrong or mixed in its intent, and yet still there is a tone of respect. Other people seem to be more called to the carpet for an outright shepherd for sale, sellout status. Gavin Ortland seems to be more towards the idea of someone who is respected but called to the carpet on specific ideas that he shared that seem dangerous and out of place for an evangelical pastor to be endorsing publicly online and from the pulpit. As you may expect for a pastor and online content creator, after being called out by Basham, Ortland fired back with two videos that he made in response to her approximate 7 pages, which addressed him, or at least partially addressed him, in her book. This situation was both relevant and irresistible to me because I like to speak out a lot against what I would call cowardly pastors, who are pastors who either intentionally remain silent or outright, as Basham may say, sell out and are shepherds for sale in the modern Western church. Now, she and I agree on a lot, and I generally agree with her conclusions. And so I'm going to put that right out there, like I did from the beginning of this video, and let you know I think that her side, if we're going to raise a hand and declare a winner, is the right side here after analysis. That said, I have learned and plan to continue to learn a lot from Gavin Ortland. I value his work specifically in the areas of church history and theology, and it's used quite effectively in combating and answering some of the false claims of Catholicism. That said, I think that you can respect someone, agree with 80, 90, or 95% of their takes, and still point out when they're wrong or when something needs to be addressed. The way I chose to address this is that I listened to her book initially on Audible, then I listened to both of Ortland's response videos, as well as his original video, which she was initially responding to in her book. Then I went through and listened to her book in the section addressing him again and took notes all the way through. Those are what I'll be speaking to right now. The first thing I noted when I listened to Ortland's response video is that he had something of a mocking tone when he says that she starts trying to look for and address a leftist agenda in the church. There's almost a bit of an eye roll both in his tone and his demeanor if you're watching his video as he says this, kind of like she's going to look for a monster to slay in a way that's unjustified. Just a note that I noticed right off the bat. This fit my personal experience and impression of Gavin Ortlund, having studied his work for quite a while and seeing that he tends to have decent theology and historical awareness. However, his beliefs on specific doctrines are quite squishy when it comes to actually addressing things like Catholicism, evolution, or even modern politics and culture and how the church ought to speak to them. Ortland's kind of big central flagship claim is that he takes major issue, to the point of kind of suggesting that Basham is a liar and a slanderer, with the idea that she suggests that it is wrong to make agreement on climate change a test of biblical faithfulness and activism on climate change a measure of gospel commitment. That's something that he focuses on a lot, and it seems to rile him up. First of all, it's worth noting that this takes place at the end of a chapter, which addresses, for the vast majority of it, people and organizations which are not Gavin Ortlund. He is one of the final examples given, but he's not the only example given. And this is given in the summary of a chapter, bringing everything together and saying what her issue is with this idea and the way it's represented in the modern Western church. But let's focus on those 2 points. Number one, that climate change is a test of biblical faithfulness, and number two, that it is a measure of gospel commitment. Well, let's look at Gavin's original video. Of climate change, Ortland says Christians can't say, oh, that's not as important. If you're pro life, you should care about climate change. It makes droughts and famines, which make people die. He goes on to say that he's not trying to scare people, but wants people to understand what a big deal climate change is. He goes on to say that earth care and stewardship, which he directly in the video connects to the idea of climate change and climate change awareness and activism, naturally flow from the Bible, and Christians should especially care about climate change. Now, with wording like that, I don't think it's at all an unfair stretch or summary to say that this is being very much pushed as a test of biblical faithfulness. This is quite clear to me and is nowhere near slanderous. But what about point number two, the measure of gospel commitment? Well, I think some of the context I already provided from his original video, all of which I will link below and I welcome you to go watch, already speaks to some of this being legitimate in the sense that it could very much at least be understood or taken by most viewers as being tied to important gospel commitment. It gets more clear though when, as Basham says in her book, in his original video, Ortland offers the ambiguous justification that climate change and the mainstream narrative and activism, all of which he endorses explicitly in his videos, are important because Christians are to love thy neighbor. And as Basham says, which Ortland takes issue with, that is basically where it stops. He doesn't tease that out or explain it any further. He just kind of drops it and leaves it there by moving on to his next point. Moving on, in his response videos, Ortland says that he takes issue with Basham's summary of him because he goes out of his way to say, I don't mention or endorse policy, speaking of public or political policy. I welcome different opinions. Now, this is true. He doesn't directly endorse policy, and he does say that he welcomes conversation and differing opinions. But this is true with a big asterisk next to it. You see, what he does do is he endorses the mainstream, often touted as the left wing, narrative about climate change. And he says that it's basically established fact. We'll dive into that a little bit later. He also hand waves away any disagreement, and again, we'll dive into those details a little bit later, but that suffices for our understanding now. So, when you endorse the mainstream narrative and hand wave away disagreement, you are essentially endorsing the policy that naturally follows and exists today. You see, this would be kind of like me endorsing the MAGA Trump idea around illegal immigration, saying that criminals come up through our border, they're coming up at rates that are too high, they come from all over the world. A border wall would be probably effective, and it would be safer for Americans if we actually closed off that border. If I said all of that and then said, but hey guys, I welcome some conversation and differing opinions, and I didn't directly endorse any policy. Would that be really true in the nature and spirit of what I was saying? No, it wouldn't be. You'd know what I was saying. You'd know that I was clearly endorsing and speaking in favor of the right wing MAGA Trumpian idea of building a border wall and reinforcing immigration control and all of these types of policies that exist and are not at all question marks to any of us. Ortland goes on to say in his response videos, I'm basically just saying, hey, we need to talk to be able to talk about and work through this issue in the church. My whole goal is to just talk about this more. That comes across as quite even handed and an open conversation, but what he doesn't really mention is the following, and it kind of taints the conversation or talk that he seems to be desiring to have. See, in his original video, he gives a several minute monologue endorsing the mainstream narrative of global warming and warning against the catastrophe that is very possibly coming if we don't act now. More on that later. And then he gives a 30-second summary, probably under 30-second, of the dissent to the mainstream narrative and sums it up by saying, I simply don't buy it. Then he appeals to the IBCC, which Basham does address in her book as being a faulty and dubious source at best. Again, here we see something of an odd conversation that is desired by Ortland. So let's give another analogy here. If I were to talk up a popular position, let's say taxing the rich at extremely high rates. That's a popular idea today. And I were to talk about the merits of it and how it's basically universally accepted as a good idea, and just about every economist who's worth their salt supports it. These are all the types of things that Gavin Ortlund very clearly says in favor of global warming in his videos. If I were to go through a litany of that and talk about how it would be bent to our benefit as a society to tax the rich higher, and how if we didn't do it, we could face economic catastrophe. And then I said, now there are some people who dissent to this, and they generally don't really seem to be well read, which Ortland says about people who dissent to climate change. And I just don't buy it though. But hey, I'm open to the conversation. I just want to. All I really want is to have this conversation more frequently and more openly in our churches. That's all I really want. Again, does that come across as being entirely genuine and open to a conversation? I just don't think it does. Also in his video, Ortland says that Basham says that he thinks that those who differ are only doing so for political purposes. I'm going to say it again because it might be a little confusing. In his video, Ortland says that Basham says that he thinks, that Ortland thinks, so she accuses him of thinking that those who differ are basically only doing so for political purposes. Now, let's see what he actually said in his videos. He says that evangelical Christians are lunging towards fundamentalism. Fundamentalism seems to be something of a boogeyman to him that he doesn't define anywhere in the videos I watched. In his original video, which Basham is addressing in her book, Ortland says that evangelicals, in his mind, tend to be skeptical, apathetic, and cautious about climate change for cultural, political, and social factors. He says that, and then he complains with the fact that she summarizes him accurately. It gets worse, though, when we remember that seconds before he says that about evangelicals tending to be skeptical, apathetic, and cautious for cultural, political, and social factors, he says that he wants us to posture ourselves right and ought not be closed off to what he's about to say. Elsewhere in the video, he circles back to this idea by saying, don't be closed minded on this. So you can't be closed off, and you must be postured right in a way that isn't closed minded. But he's allowed to say that evangelicals tend to be the skeptical and apathetic and cautious crowd for cultural, political, and social factors. Do you see any irony in this statement? And I think I certainly do, as does Basham. Ortland also says in his video that even evangelicals are often anti science. But again, don't be closed off or closed minded to what he's saying. Just accept that you and your crowd are often and thus likely anti science. Do you see how odd this is? In his response video to Basham's book, Ortland seems to want to make it clear that he's not an expert. He seems to want something of a pass on some of his statements because he recognizes that he's not an expert and that he doesn't know what's going to happen in the case of climate change. But let's look at what he said originally in the video that Basham was responding to. First of all, he repeatedly endorses the claims and elevates the authority of the IPCC, which Basham goes out of her way to address and show the shortcomings thereof in her work. And while not being an expert, which he focuses on multiple times, Ortland does recite the climate change mainstream narrative, again, several minutes worth of it. He endorses it and says that if it's false, it is a high level of conspiracy and hoax. He then takes issue when Basham says in her book, and I quote, to not buy into the consensus, Ortland says, is to buy into conspiracy and hoax. So let's try and clarify that for a moment. Ortlund does indeed, in his original video, say that if it is false, meaning the climate change mainstream narrative, then it is a high level of conspiracy and hoax. Basham then says that Ortlund says to not buy into the climate change mainstream narrative is to buy into conspiracy and hoax. So Basham is saying that if you don't accept the mainstream narrative, Ortland believes that you are believing there is some kind of massive conspiracy and hoax. And Ortland is saying that if you don't believe the mainstream narrative, if it is false, what the mainstreamers have put out there about climate change, then it must be a massive conspiracy or hoax. This is not an issue. Basham is exactly right in her summary of what he said. To his clarification that he's not an expert, Ortland adds that he does not want to scare or shame people. He repeats this claim multiple times. So, how does this non expert, non scaring, or shaming individual share his points? Well, as already addressed a little bit, he shares them by comparing climate change awareness and activism to being pro life. He shares them by tying to them directly the idea of loving your neighbor and biblical stewardship that flows from the Bible. He shares them by overtly endorsing a narrative and by hand waving away dissent, with what is honestly much less than an intentional and fair overview of that dissent after giving a lengthy and detailed overview of the accepted mainstream narrative. The non expert, non shaming, non scaring individual reminds his audience not to be closed minded and not to be like many evangelicals, which are closed off and anti science. Lastly, while he does later clarify that he doesn't know what's going to happen and he likes to magnify the idea that he's not an expert, he does insist that climate change is a quote, big problem. Sea levels rise, coral reefs can be destroyed, there can be an increase in weather events, drastic and destructive weather events, droughts, hurricanes, wildfires, and acidic oceans. There can be health hazards, there can be invasive insects, there can be a loss of snow caps, there can be a threat to farmers and crops. People can die, there can be famine, there can be all these types of dangers, all of which, by the way, are taken from his video. I didn't make that up. Again, go watch it for yourself. But then he says, remember, I'm not trying to scare you, and I don't know what's going to happen. I'm not trying to be doomsday, but it's a big deal. I think about it every day, and we need to be talking about it. Now, again, let's be honest with ourselves. If we were having a conversation with Ortland or sitting in his church and we heard this presentation with these little disclaimers of, hey, I'm not trying to be doomsday and hey, I don't know what's going to happen, really be things that seem to be elevated to the same importance, validity, and legitimacy in the conversation as the doomsday scenarios that are presented as being possible, I just don't think so. I don't think this is an even-handed representation, and I think that anyone who reflects on it deeply has to agree with and know that. Again, I'm big on putting the shoe on the other foot, so let's try to flip this and give it an analogy from the other side to get it across more clearly. Let's say that you're talking with me and I say, "Hey, look, I think about illegal immigration every day. I think that many Christians are anti-data and anti-census reports about this topic. I think they're blind to it. I think that you really need to be open-minded about this, assess your posture, and be receptive to it. Unlike many evangelicals, which are not. And the risks here are that look, we could lose our jobs, our economy could be destroyed, our women could be killed, our kids could be enslaved. Look, our military could be infiltrated, and terrorist events could be happening across our nation. Now, I'm not an expert, and I don't know what's going to happen, but those are all possibilities. Now, if I said that to you, how would you receive that? Let's be honest about what's happening here with Gavin Ortland. To close off this point, on one hand, he wants to kind of be given a pass or given some wiggle room because he's not an expert. But on the other hand, he recites the mainstream narrative and says that the data seems correct to him. He says the mainstream narrative seems extremely well supported. There's consensus, and it seems like it's basic, intuitive, common sense. And he speaks with this absolutist idea about this thing that he also wants to remind you he's not an expert on. Ortland insists that he is interested in two things: the truth and church triage. Now, we can take him at his word about trying to pursue the truth, even though I'm sure he would agree that at times we are all blind to or biased against the truth in our own lives. The whole church triage thing seems a bit like a cheap talking point and a buzzword to me, but that's neither here nor there, and that's not really what this video is about. Ortland does say something somewhat odd to me, though. He says some people walk away from books like Basham saying maybe he's a wolf, maybe he's not a legitimate leader. And he asks, does that smell like the kingdom of God to you? To which I say, have you read the New Testament? One of the things that we are most commonly warned against is false teachers, wolves in sheep's clothing. Heck, we even see a non wolf, Peter, being rebuked publicly by Paul. So, if questioning leaders and asking whether or not they are right before God and justified in their saying doesn't smell like the kingdom of God to Gavin Ortlund, that's a red flag for me. I'm sorry, but it just is. He points out that Basham suggests that opposition to false leaders should arise within churches, that the churches are facing civil war, and that open war is among us as a church and as Christians. He doesn't like that and seems to cast it, even though I don't believe he uses the word extremist as something of an extremist or radical idea. He would probably call this something like fundamentalism. Again, all I really need to say on this point, though, is read the New Testament. She's right. She's always been right. This has been the case since the very foundations of the Christian belief. There is a civil war, not only in the world between good and evil, but in the church between the wolves in sheep's clothing and even the well intentioned leaders who sometimes get it wrong, and those who are there to justifiably correct them and rightly shepherd God's flock. That's absolutely reality. In his original video, Ortland claims that there would be a lot of incentive to disprove the mainstream narrative, and he appeals to the consensus many times. Two notes on this. One is that science is not conducted by consensus. It never has been, and it never will be. The steam engine was called Fulton's folly when it was invented. The idea of germ theory was ruthlessly mocked by the medical and scientific consensus of the day. Consensus does not matter. And the idea that there would be a lot of incentive rather to disprove the mainstream narrative is correctly identified and smacked down in Basham's book, where she points out that the exact opposite is true. Going against the mainstream consensus or the mainstream narrative is very unpopular and dangerous to your career and possibly your life at times. That's about all for assessing his claims in his videos against her book. But now let's assess her book against his claims. And this is going to go a little bit quicker because there's a lot of overlap and they tend to have already been addressed. Basham in her work does title Ortland as a creation care activist, which, given his words, I think is fair. He doesn't seem to like that, though. She also noteworthily says that he has been successful in his exploration of apologetics and theology, which I also agree with, as I have said earlier in this video. Ortland goes out of his way to point out that this is one video she's criticizing out of 300 plus that he's made. However, given that he generally does seem to be on point theologically, I think her answer, judging by this book, and mine would be yes, that's the point. You mix in this nonsense and this poorly addressed topic with a lot of legitimate arguments and Christian beliefs, and it normalizes it in the church. It's like a math teacher who typically is on point in his equations, speaking authoritatively about math, suddenly one day speaking about history in an erroneous way. The danger is that the people who rightly have learned to trust him and look to him as an authority might take his fallacious arguments about history as gospel truth, even though they ought not. Basham correctly points out that in his original video, Ortland says he is deeply burdened by the Christian dismissal of climate change, and he does indeed draw a line of distinction between conservatives and liberals who are traditionally more tied to the idea of climate change. Ortland didn't seem to like the idea that Basham accuses him of making it political, but he clearly and overtly does. Basham also justifiably corrects Ortlund's incorrect claim about weather conditions and global warming. She corrects him again justifiably on the false claim about scientific consensus. She rightly points out that he does indeed suggest that those who disagree are doing so largely due to politics and or not studying or hitting the books. One thing I can point out here is that she might overstate it and say that he says this is always the case, while he says this is largely the case. However, it's a pretty small critique and one that I think he doesn't even really hit on. She points out that what she wants to do is to remind the church that there is a debate about this topic, a legitimate debate with people like the Cornwall Alliance who deserve to be heard and considered, while Gavin tends to handwave away the debate and dissent. It's also worth noting that in her book, Basham goes out of her way to show and demonstrate with evidence when someone is a shepherd for sale or a group for sale, like with the EIT in chapter 2, right after she addresses Ortland. Given the content of the rest of her book and the way that she addresses people in a head on and clear manner, I think that Basham has absolutely earned it to be said of her that if she wanted to call Gavin Ortland a shepherd for sale, she would have called him a shepherd for sale. She didn't, and that matters. As a matter of fact, in the intro of her book, she notes that some of the people who she will be addressing in her work are people who she learns from, though she has now adopted and advises some caution around how we learn from them. I think this is totally fair. All right, that's about all for the comparison. Now I want to give a little bit of my personal insight. I don't want to put words in either of these individuals' mouths, but I'm going to be trying to share a little bit of quick conjecture and my takeaways from this situation from the book and the response videos and the original video. My guess is that Basham would agree with the following when I say that I agree with Ortland that there is a type of stewardship that Christians should look for and embrace in dealing with nature. However, what I would also add as a qualifier is that I don't think that stewardship looks anything like the modern narrative around climate change, which is fraught with outside social pressures, coercion, money and power grabbing, and many outright lies. As Basham points out, one of the only sources which Gavin cites authoritatively as a piece of evidence, the IBCC, is deep in the corruption itself. Lastly, here are a few of my general takeaways for people like Ortland, and there's just a little bit of each of these peppered within the way that I view his videos and his responses to Basham's work. One is the idea to kind of stay in your lane or get truly educated and share both sides thoroughly and evenly if you're looking to have a completely open discussion and raise a topic simply as a talking point rather than as a preaching point. Another is, man, stop being a bit of a leftist. This is clear in posts like this that I'll share where Ortland lambasts people who think that the 2020 election may have been stolen or had fraud in it, which, as someone who was literally in that election, I can tell you there's a lot of evidence to support. He completely blasts people who even suggest that violence may at some point be necessary to save our country. This is something that I think there's a very nuanced and complex conversation around, especially given that our country was founded on rebellious violence for the sake of freedom. This is a conversation that I think has a lot of angles and approach vectors to it, but to simply disown it and blast people who say that it might be the case is quite irresponsible. He neatly groups together those who refuse the COVID vaccine with those who believe, and I quote, QAnon stuff. Lastly, he somewhat vaguely seems to scold Christians who sue public schools for conspiratorial purposes. I'm not 100% sure what he's referring to here, but I think, and the only example I can think of, which would tie into his mainstream view of what is conspiratorial and fit the fact that Christians sue public schools, would be Christians around the country suing public schools for having sexually explicit content in their reading curriculum and in their school libraries for minors. If anyone has a correction or clarification on exactly what he was talking about and it's not what I suggested, let me know. I don't want to get it wrong, but suffice it to say that if he is decrying such lawsuits, that's absurd. I think the bottom line here, though, is that rants like this one, which are not exactly rare for Gavin Ortland, do come across more as a left wing professor than a pastor. My final three takeaways are number one, given the content of this video up to this point, I think Ortland should be more careful about how he speaks and how fairly he represents issues that he is speaking to. Number two, I think he needs to know and justify his claims and his sources better than he seems to have. He didn't have many sources, and the ones he did present were quite problematic. And finally, be careful whose hands you drive the church flock into. When your citations and consensus authority claims ultimately boil down to corrupt, power grabbing elitists who have a general and overt idea of hating the biblical family, rejecting God, and thus standing against what we as Christians must hold most dear, I think there's a problem there.
All right, that's all for today, guys. Let me know what you think and have a good one.